Well, it's truly an honor to have our two next guests on the stage, Matt Continetti and George Will, two people who need no introduction. I want to start with something that I remember you saying, George, back in the day. You know, when we used to reminisce about the Goldwater election of 1964 and say that Goldwater may have lost 44 states in 1964, but he won the future. And your reference was to the Reagan era and all the things that came after Goldwater's defeat. But with maybe another 40 years of hindsight, given the enactment of the Great Society, the entitlements, the charts I showed earlier, you weren't here for this, but the fact that Goldwater led to a racial polarization between the Republican and Democratic parties, do you still believe that Goldwater won the future?
I do, and I question whether you can say Goldwater led to a racial polarization. That might be the post hoc propter hoc fallacy. It seems to me that what I said was that Goldwater won in '64. It just took 16 years to count the votes. And I think a lot of political science and history so far now indicates that what drove the Goldwater vote primarily, particularly in the South, was foreign policy. And that the South had been trending Republican, really with Eisenhower in '52, again in '56. And Goldwater came along, not starting the wave, but riding the crest of a wave. He won the future in the sense that, and this is a dubious achievement perhaps, we began to have what the political scientists in the early '50s all wanted, which is why can't we sort out our political parties so that they have a crisp, clean ideological profile and we'll have politics more like Europe. Well, we did it, and I don't think everyone's happy. When I came here to work in the Senate staff in 1970, it was, of course, completely run by Democrats such as Fulbright of Arkansas, McClellan of Arkansas, Stennis of Mississippi, Eastland of Mississippi, Russell from Winder, Georgia, Sparkman from Alabama. These were all the committee chairs in the House were basically Southern segregationists. And there aren't any more conservative Democrats anymore, there aren't any more liberal Republicans anymore, and no one's happy.
And what has that meant for the thing that we're now calling freedom conservatism, the statement of principles that you signed on to? What is the state of freedom and the conservative movement?
Well, there are two things going on. One is, let me get pedantic here for a moment, we are witnessing a retreat from Isaiah Berlin's 1958 Chichele lecture called The Two Concepts of Liberty. We're witnessing a rebirth of belief in positive liberty, building off Franklin Roosevelt's statement, necessitous men are not free. People are now saying freedom is the absence of necessity in life, which means it's really elusive and it's coming tomorrow, and tomorrow is always a day away. We see more and more Americans saying positive liberty means if you have health care, you're freer. If you have housing, you're freer. And this is basically the Chinese social compact. We will give you material goods that you need, and we will call it freedom, and you will be obedient. And that's the trade-off. On the other hand, there is, it seems to me, a need to revitalize, and I hope your organization does this, our organization does this, Berlin's insistence on the negative concept of liberty. Liberty is the absence of restraints imposed by others. It is valuable for the following reasons. It's not to say that there should never be restraints, but that we should, but as Bishop Berkeley said, everything is what it is and not another thing. And liberty should be called liberty and nothing else. In today's particular context, what amazes me is the extent to which no argument is ever settled in this country.
Well, is it T.S. Eliot who said there's no such thing as a lost cause because there's no such thing as a gained cause?
Yeah, exactly. And we're having, I mean, all the arguments we're having about industrial policy, it's a little bit disheartening to have to do it over and over again, but the alternative is to not live very long. And since I'm 82,
That's
I'm
right. You know,
condemned to
you're on your third cycle now, probably,
Exactly.
right? Well, Matt, you wrote this book called The Right, We Have It Outside, a new history of the conservative movement, and not just the conservative movement, but also political forces, the rise of Trump, and many other things. Where are we in the scheme of things? What is the relationship between freedom and conservatism today?
Sure. Thank you, Ovik, and thank you for having me. And it's just such an honor to be on the same panel as George. George has been writing his Washington Post column for 50 years, and he continues to break barriers. Just the other week, he had what I believe to be the best columnist disclosure note in the history of the newspaper columnists. This was his column calling on Tim Scott to drop out of the Republican primary race, and the top of the column says, "The columnist's wife works for Senator Scott. She will not agree with this column."
I remember that one. That was
one
a good
reason why George is the eminence that he is. So where are we? Freedom and conservatism. Well, the important thing to understand about American conservatism is that the adjective modifies the noun. American conservatism is distinct from other national forms of conservatism because we begin with the Charter of Liberty, the Declaration of Independence. And that Charter of Liberty was institutionalized in another document, the Constitution. The Constitution was explained in another set of documents, the Federalist. And together, these three documents inaugurate the American political tradition, which extends through Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King, Ronald Reagan, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, all part of this large American tradition in which the American people are struggling to define and to achieve self-governance, right? Out of reflection and choice, not accident and force. And so American conservatism is always going to be distinctly with an eye toward freedom, because it's in the national DNA. You cannot have an American conservative movement that rejects America's founding principles and documents. It is not the thing. You can have other forms of conservatism that do that, and many of them are on display in the world. But we have to understand that American conservatism begins with our charters of liberty. Right now, though, I think what George says is a way to respond to your question. America is having to relearn things. The essayist Tom Wolfe wrote a magisterial piece in the 1980s called The Great Relearning.
I think that was about relearning how to brush your teeth, though, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, it was about relearning all of the facts of life after having lived through the derangement of the 60s and the 70s. And I think we're just at the beginning of our great relearning, unfortunately. And when I look at the world today, I see that not a willingness to face facts, but in fact a flight from them, and a flight from reason in many of our key cultural institutions. So our job, I think, for believers in freedom, believers in order, believers in the Constitution and the Declaration, is to make people face the facts of the world. And also one of those facts, the key fact, is the distinctiveness of American conservatism.
What if you're not a conservative? If you're not a conservative, you mentioned FDR, you mentioned MLK, both of them would not have described themselves as conservative, but argued that they were aligned with the American tradition. What's the role for them, for say the center left in this conversation?
Well, my view is that this is a dialogue. And there's, if you look at the American political tradition as a whole, there are some figures who are going to lean toward the side of equal when the phrase is equal freedom. Mm-hmm. And then there's going to be other political figures who are going to lean toward the side of freedom when you have those. We're all looking for equal freedom, right? And so there has to be a dialogue, and there has to be an acceptance that either side in this dialogue has something to contribute. However, when I look at the political scene today, I see a closing off of dialogue. I see a demonization of the other. And I see forces at work on the radical side, both the radical left and the radical right, who reject the American experiment. And so if anything, I think that people who identify as conservatives, and I can say as a conservative, this is what I believe, we should be looking for friends on the center left who want to continue the dialogue that was inaugurated almost 250 years ago. And together we need to form a united front against the radicals who want to tear down our society. And unfortunately, we see this willingness to tear down our society on almost every front.
What do you think are the most persuasive arguments? I mean, you've written this column, George, for so long. What do you think are the arguments that have landed with people who are skeptical of the role of negative rights of individual and economic freedom?
I think it's this, that to the extent that you do not focus your political philosophy and hence your political practice on individuals, to that extent you are going to willy-nilly wind up focusing it on groups with identities defined by unalterable and accidental outcomes. To the extent that markets do not allocate wealth and opportunity, and they can't always allocate all of it, but to the extent that it doesn't, it will be done by politics. And to the extent that it's done by politics, the stakes of politics will rise. And as the stakes of politics rise, the bitterness of politics will rise commensurately among people who feel that their outcome in life was not fair.
Is that why politics has become so nationalized now? Because more decisions?
That's part of it. But I think we talk much too much about material outcomes, Western Pennsylvania steel industry, free trade, all that stuff. Whereas I think what really has changed is the allocation not of wealth but of status. The fact that a great many Americans used to be part of a working class that was in some ways valorized, particularly during and after the Second World War. Now we live in a society in which only a third of Americans go to college, and a Democratic administration run by blue-collar, lunch-pail Joe Biden is obsessed with student loans. I don't know if you've looked at the crosstabs in the New York Times Siena poll that just came out. I think they asked in each of the states what percentage of people had student loans. Trivial. The resentment, I suspect, among those people of the obsession with student loans on the part of lunch pail blue-collar Joe is considerable.
That's a great point. And as I mentioned in the earlier panel, we have a session on higher education where we will be diving into that. Preston Cooper on our team has been writing a lot about the student loan bailouts. Matt, we haven't spent a lot of time talking about the presidential race, the 2024 presidential race yet this morning. Give us your thoughts on where these competing philosophies stand. I mean, to the typical political observer, the pro-freedom side of the Republican Party is losing, but maybe that's not the case. What would you say?
Well, George actually just wrote about this in the past week on the subject of military assistance to Ukraine and how the skepticism towards such assistance on the part of some prominent senators, primarily J.D. Vance of Ohio, reflected a turning back of the Republican Party, a potential turning back of the Republican Party back to its pre-World War II self. And this was, in fact, one of the major themes of my book, The Right, which you were so generous to have outside, which is that when I look at the Republican Party today, it resembles more closely to me the Republican Party of the 1920s than it does, say, the Republican Party of the 1980s or 1990s.
And why is that? What do you think it is that has made that trend happen?
Well, in many ways, we are living through another Gilded Age. And so if you look at the 1920s as kind of the long tail of the first Gilded Age at the turn of the 20th century, you can see some similarities. One is a remarkable influx of immigration into this country, a huge increase in the number of foreign-born Americans, characterizes both the first Gilded Age and our own. The second is high levels of inequality, both in the first Gilded Age and now in the second. And interestingly enough, and this has only kind of reappeared in the last 10 years or so, high levels of political instability. In the first Gilded Age, it was the labor movement. It was the Haymarket strike. It was anarchism. It was a lot, and then of course it was violence against blacks in the South as well, right? There was a large level of mob violence or just general civil unrest during the first Gilded Age. I think we're beginning to see that again in the United States in the second period. And so it makes a certain amount of historical sense, or you can see a certain type of historical analogy at work, that the parties would kind of begin to reflect older coalitions. I think the largest reason why this Republican Party may be taking the turn that George laments in his column is the absence of the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. When I think about the history of the Republican Party in the 20th century, the post-World War II Republican Party is very exceptional because it's a party governed by internationalists. They're conservative internationalists, but they're nonetheless internationalists. They believe America ought to be engaged in the world. And I think one reason that the conservative movement and the Republican Party adopted this internationalist position after World War II was the threat from the Soviet Union. And the threat of global communism as personified in the Soviet Union was unique. It was unique in a few ways. One was the religious angle. If you were a social or religious conservative, you despised what the Soviet Union because what it meant about atheism. The second was the ethnic angle. Many people who became part of the Reagan coalition had relatives, some distant, some close, in the captive nations. Right? This is why Gerald Ford got in trouble in 1976 in that debate with Jimmy Carter where he said there was no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. Right? Because, well, people knew that in their bones that there was. And the third was the ideological challenge was such. It was a real intellectual fight between freedom and tyranny. When we look at the world today, none of those conditions apply. And we're only beginning now to view China in the same way that for much of the 20th century, the right viewed the Soviet Union. Even then, though, we're still not there. And so on one level, you see this parallel with the first Gilded Age, and on another level, you see what happens when the conservative movement, the Republican Party, cannot unite around a common enemy, that common enemy of Soviet communism.
It's interesting. You both have brought up points about the state of our current politics that are not really directly about economics, but your point about the dignity of workers and how the... Go ahead. If I've mischaracterized it, please.
No, you're onto it. Mark Twain gave the name to the Gilded Age. It was the title of one of his less successful novels, but he could be a scourge of the rich. Inconveniently, one of his best friends was a hugely successful executive of Standard Oil, which was the great Satan of its day. And a journalist once asked him, said, "Mr. Twain, don't you think your friend's wealth is tainted?" And he said, "Damn right, it's doubly tainted. It tain't yours and it tain't mine." What's different today is the prevalence of envy. Envy is a singularly curdling, what do we call it, emotion. It's the only one of the 7 deadly sins that doesn't give the sinner even momentary pleasure. I'll pause while you go down the list. But a society in which envy is encouraged, it's one thing for Theodore Roosevelt to talk about malefactors of great wealth while getting almost all of his campaign funding from 4 people, as I recall. But that was passing rhetoric. I don't think envy entered the mainstream of our life to the degree that it now has, and I think that has to do with people's sense that things are rigged and that far too much is determined by education and far too much by cognitive abilities. 200 years ago, the great source of wealth in our society was land. We had so much of it, we were giving it away, essentially, under the Homestead Act. And also, 100 years ago, great source of wealth was heavy fixed capital. Andrew Carnegie's steel mills, Vanderbilt's New York Central Railroad. Today, it's knowledge, information. It is necessarily what's driving the cognitive stratification of the country. And that makes for a kind of bitterness and envy that we don't have an answer to yet, but we better get one.
And also, another source of wealth in our society today, and another difference between the two periods, is government, the growth of government.
Quite.
And we can see this in the headlines every day, that government is a great means to wealth. And so this is a place, I think, where freedom conservatives can make common ground with other conservatives to understand that the growth of government enriches all the wrong people and also contributes to envy, right? Because there may have been the same amount of envy in the first Gilded Age as the second, if you're just on a distributional level, but the difference is government now is the agent of satisfying your envy in a way that it was not at the beginning of the 20th century.
There's a German economist named Rainer Zittelmann who's actually studied this in countries around the world, and he asks people the question, tries to ask the same question in every country: do you believe that the people in your country who are wealthy got there through hard work, or did they get there through luck? And various other forms of that question. And then he asks them various questions about what are your views about tax policy and things like that. And what he finds is that wherever people believe that those who are economically successful got their success through connections and cronyism and luck rather than through hard work and effort, those are the places where there's much more support for whether it's socialism or just a more interventionist social democratic approach to economic policy.
In the previous panel, reference was made to Elizabeth Warren and her echo in Tucker Carlson. Seems to me Elizabeth Warren has a firm grip on half a point. She says there's something a little odd that 5 of the 10 richest counties in the United States by per capita income are in the Washington metropolitan area. We don't have natural resources, we don't make anything except laws, regulations, and trouble, but we get this enormous trillions of dollars sloshing through. A lot of it sticks here. Why? Because the government is responsive to intense, compact, well-lawyered, highly articulate interest groups, necessarily tiny minorities who know how to exercise the levers and pulleys and ropes of this opaque thing, the government. So necessarily, as government becomes more central to the allocation of wealth and opportunity, it is going to redistribute income upward. It's a regressive force.
Let me ask one more question before we go to questions from the audience. I'm just thinking a lot about this point about dignity and how important that is. That's clearly an element of what's going on in our politics. What I observe is, if you take the Republican Party, for example, what we see is that Republican politicians are typically very populist in their rhetoric. They do a great job in their speeches and in their comments of ascribing dignity to the humble working man and woman in the streets. But from a policy standpoint, that isn't always where they end up. It's basically this bifurcation of, well, I'm going to be very populist on culture, but on economics, not necessarily. They may be actually increasing the role of government and the role of elites and things like that. So, what's the solution to that problem?
Government isn't really good at redistributing dignity. It's not really good, and someone has to tell the junior senator from Connecticut, at curing loneliness. It's just not good at that. What government's really good at is writing checks. Social security system, it gets the job done. Knows how to do that. Doesn't know how to do these other things. Doesn't know how to build model cities, as we learned long ago. Not too good at head starts, as a matter of fact. I mean, we have all these wonderful bits of legislation that are, someone said our legislation is like Marx Brothers movies. The titles of them, horse feathers and duck soup, don't tell you what's inside. And because the law, it is really not an, I was going to say a blunt instrument, it's not an instrument at all for reallocating status, it seems to me.
Yeah. Now, politics of redistribution, you can argue with each other. I'm going to give you a piece of this, you give me a little bit of that. Politics of recognition is very different. People interpret a politics of recognition as a zero-sum game. Donald Trump sees one group of people, and Joe Biden sees another. It's a huge fight within the Democratic Party right now over which group within the Democratic coalition Biden is seeing. Biden is recognizing. It's responsible for Biden's huge drop in youth support in the past 2 weeks. So we somehow need to get back to ultimately a politics of freedom in my view, but if a politics of redistribution is the stopping point on the way back to a politics of constitutionalism and freedom, that's, I think, a healthier outcome for America as a society. Because right now we're kind of trapped in this zero-sum game. And I think that begins by de-emphasizing identity, by recognizing that all of us are individuals with dignity and value inherent to our person, and treating each other as individuals worthy of respect, worthy of opportunity, capable of great things if given the chance, and de-emphasizing all of the inherited group identities that have, I think, diverted the conversation in America to very unhealthy places.
And there's a particularly toxic role for group identities that has been reinforced by the Supreme Court in a way that was relevant to the previous panel, where people were talking about getting away from the filter used and the emphasis on college degrees. A lot of that goes back to the Duke Power decision in the Supreme Court. Duke Power had a test that they gave for potential job applicants, and lo and behold, there was a disparate impact on minorities. Supreme Court therefore said, you can't have that test. I think at that point, a lot of businesses threw up their hands and said, the hell with it. We're not going to try and devise a test that will not have a disparate impact. We're just going to ask for a college degree. That is the sort of thing that happens when you get away from individualism and you get away from thinking about individuals and start thinking about groups, underrepresented groups, marginalized groups, whatever adjective you want to apply to it. And you get the further bureaucratization of life and unhappiness all around.
Well, we talked earlier this morning about where there have been policy victories, and one of the great policy victories of the last year has been the Students for Fair Admissions case, where the Supreme Court said race-based admissions in higher education settings was a violation of the 14th Amendment, and we have a session at this conference about what are the future knock-on litigate or lawsuits that may translate that form of that interpretation of the 14th Amendment to a lot of things that you're talking about.
They're already underway attacking law firms that have special minority scholarships and minority internships and all the rest. I think the Students for Fair Admissions was a decision well worth making, even though it will make not a particle of difference in how the admissions departments operate. It'll make them more opaque and more cynical and more dishonest.
I hope you're wrong. We'll see.
I'm
How about some
wrong.
questions? Please raise your hand if you got a question. It's hard for me to see with the light, so I'll let whoever's got the mic pass it around.
Seems to have larger lessons for us. If you have a population that is defined by the idea that, that there is gross injustice, that somebody else has my stuff, and that I am a perpetual victim, then it seems like where it has ended up is where it must end up. And I'm wondering, particularly now that we're looking at what's going on in college campuses around the US, whether you think this will be a wake-up call or what your prognostications are as we look at Gen Z and politics in terms of their sources of knowledge and influence and information and how they react.
I certainly view it as a wake-up call. I was just speaking with a student today.
Just to repeat the question was about how the Israel-Gaza situation has changed your opinions.
Especially in college campuses. And this one student was visiting a cousin, this student's Israeli, he was visiting a cousin who's at Columbia. He said that at one of the protests over the weekend, the pro-Hamas forces were going door to door in a dorm looking for Jewish students. This is the United States of America. This is, to me, unbelievable. So I think it's a wake-up call. I think it's putting the Democratic Party in a schizophrenic position where you have these fights now breaking out over some of the rhetoric that figures like Rashida Tlaib is using, Like I said earlier, I think it's forcing Biden to be in a political crouch because it's contributing to the drop-off among the Gen Z vote for him. So I think it's a political wake-up call. I think it's a social wake-up call. And I also think it's a geopolitical wake-up call because the enemies of freedom now seem to me to be on the march everywhere, including in our own country. And that, I think, is alarming. And it also, by the way, it makes the electorate much more open to possibilities that may have been foreclosed just a few years earlier. And that's why I think we see these polls again and again. It's not just the New York Times poll that George mentioned. The Washington Post poll from a few weeks ago said the same thing, that if the election were held today, Donald Trump would beat Joe Biden. Now, why is that? I think it's because whether it's inflation, whether it's the southern border, whether it's the world situation, whether it's the general sense, as I said, that civil unrest is returning, the American people do not have confidence in the current leadership, and that makes them, again, more open to revisit choices they made in the past, and also more open, I think, in general, to choices that I, for one, would not have thought were possible even a few months ago.
George, you have any thoughts on
Well,
this?
yeah, there are occasions, and this is one, where worse is better. I'm not going into Marxist dialectics here. The German communists said in 1933 when Hitler came to power, they said, "Nach Hitler kommen wir." They were quite complacent. They said, after Hitler we come because he will intensify the contradictions of capitalism, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not arguing that. I'm saying this with regard to academia. When Americans hear that, a prominent person has said that he finds the predatory sadism of Hamas exhilarating. No American thinks that occurred at a Chamber of Commerce lunch in Wichita or in a union hall in Youngstown. Everyone knows it could only have occurred on a college campus. Because as Orwell said, there's something so stupid only an intellectual can believe it. The long withdrawing roar, not of religious faith, but of confidence in our institutions of higher education, is overdue and welcome because the long march through the institutions has accomplished that to the extent that there is a kind of common academic culture from Harvard's graduate school to kindergarten in Flagstaff, Arizona. It's the same stuff. When these fresh-faced kids get to Harvard from Columbus, Ohio, and Columbus, Georgia, or Fort Wayne and Fort Worth, did they learn this stuff about Hamas at the dinner table? I doubt it. Did they learn it in high school? Maybe a little bit, but they learned most of it at Harvard, where they were taught probably in freshman orientation by the bureaucracy of the DEI people that to look at the world as in a binary way. There are the oppressors and the oppressed. Once you do that, Israel's in the crosshairs. They learned it at college. And as I say, the faster we can withdraw prestige from these institutions, the better it is going to be for freedom. 60 or so years ago, Kennedy wins the 1960 election. And they said the professors have won, and indeed they had. They said, well, the Charles River is running into the Potomac River. And it was considered a real ornament to have Schlesinger and James Galbraith and the Bundy brothers and the Rostow brothers and Henry Kissinger and Pat Moynihan on the way. Having ornaments from academia was considered an elegant thing for an administration. No more. Who cares? Who wants them? I mean, so this is bad. I mean, it's terrible that our institutions of higher education are like that, but it's good that we know it.
Is there one back there? Go ahead.
Hi, would you comment on one of my favorite Milton Friedman quotes, is the failure of public policy is confusing results with intentions?
The question was, could you comment on the insight that the failure of public policy is the confusion of results with intentions?
I had a moment in June of 2021, the rare moment where one of my predictions comes true, and that is that the inflation was beginning to show up. And I wrote a column with the title Milton Friedman's Revenge, where I quoted another Milton Friedman aphorism, which is that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, and used this to say that no Biden, no Yellen, the inflation will not be temporary. I do this not just to pat myself on the back, but to say that Milton Friedman is enjoying, I think, something of a renaissance. And in the next month, the Stanford historian Jennifer Burns will be coming out with the first major biography of Milton Friedman, and I think it will be a significant moment, and it will be an opportunity to revisit not just the insight you pointed out, or the one that I mentioned, but Friedman's general view. If there's one key point from Milton Friedman I think we should keep in mind, is that Friedman always stressed the interconnection between political and economic freedom. This was his major point. We had to support economic freedom because once economic freedom was diminished, political freedom would come next. And I think we see that. We have historical examples, but we also see it at work in American society today. Just as our economic freedom has lessened, if you view the Heritage Index as any measure, our political system is becoming more fragile, and our political freedoms, our civil liberties, are becoming endangered as well. And so any opportunity we have to revisit the legacy of Milton Friedman is one we should seize.
Yes, the confusion of intentions and results is apparent in the titles of the intentional titles of legislation like model cities and Head Starts and all the rest. My best friend for many years was Pat Moynihan, the finest social scientist ever to serve in the national legislature, who never tired of saying, social science can't tell us what to do, it can tell us the results of what we're doing. And
It's not always that good at that.
no, I suppose not, but it sort of kept the Journal of Public Interest going for a while, just documenting the problems. Friedman understood, John Locke understood, the point of private property is it creates a zone of sovereignty for the people who possess. In late 1960s, when the world and I were young, I taught at the University of Toronto, where the leading light in our Department of Political Economy was a political philosopher named C.B. McPherson, who wrote about possessive individualism, and he deplored both parts of that. He disliked individualism in political philosophy, and he disliked what is a natural consequence of individualism, an emphasis on possessions, on property. And it seems to me if you're going to defend freedom, and that's what this fine organization exists to do, you begin by saying that freedom implies a zone of sovereignty protected by possessions, and most of all, the unenumerated right. We're working, the Institute for Justice and others are working to get it enumerated sooner or later. The unenumerated right to earn a living unimpeded in the vocation of your choice. Without that, you don't have freedom.
One of the things that you're both alluding to is that, the title of our panel is The Moral Case for Freedom. And one of, what I hear you both saying in different ways is that one of the strongest moral cases for freedom is that it allows a country of 330 million people to live with each other when they have different aspirations,
Classical
different goals, different ways
liberalism
of life.
keeps the peace. That's what it does. There are two ways of looking at politics. You can discern, you can postulate the ideal and pursue it, or you can recognize the worst and avoid it. And I believe freedom's friends are those who do the latter. What freedom's friends have to do is say that there's nothing lasts, everything's endangered. What is the big threat? My view is today that once you abandon the classic liberal understanding of freedom, which is that there is such a thing as human nature, and from which you can deduce natural rights which are essential to the flourishing of creatures of this nature, as established by historical experience. Once you do that, you have a firm basis of freedom. Once you abandon that, once you abandon the idea of a fixed human nature, you fall into the hands of those who say, the definition of an individual is his or her malleability. and consciousness becomes a political project. And the government must use those in possession of the truth, the knowledge of the right side of history and all that, must superintend the development of consciousness. And that way is the way you wind up either in the Cambodia of the Khmer Rouge or today's average American campus.
I think we should also keep in mind that the other side of the coin of freedom is responsibility. They have to be twins. They have to be partners. And I think in America today, people understand freedom only in their ability to be their worst selves. Mm-hmm. We need to reassert that freedom means taking responsibility for your actions. Freedom means being responsible for the role that you inhabit in society, that you have a place in society, whether that is as a child, whether that is as a sibling, whether that is of a parent, whether that's a member of a vocation, a part of a voluntary association. We have to, if even a member of Congress has a role in society and a responsibility they have to play. Everywhere in our society today, we see the shirking of responsibility. And so you're right. How does freedom enable us to live together? Well, it's not only that we live in freedom, but that we take responsibility. And we understand both our own responsibilities, but also our responsibilities as citizens of the United States. That is how freedom allows us to live together.
The political problem, definite article, the political problem is that human beings are opinionated and egotistical, which is to say they prefer their opinions. And the question is, how do you keep the peace among people like this? The answer is, for example, you say, I was just participating in a debate in Canada. They have the monk debates in Toronto. Our question was resolve liberalism, classic liberalism, gets the big questions right. One way it does is by not answering the big questions. Is there a God, 10 gods, 20 gods, neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg? I don't care. It was my side of the debate, it was me and Jacob Rees-Mogg, a devout Catholic member of British Parliament. I said, he's devout, I'm an amiable, low-voltage atheist. We get along just fine. Because the government is neutral about lots of things. And that is essential to the culture of freedom.
To both of you, what is the thing that about the pro-freedom thing that you're most optimistic about? What is the thing that you're most optimistic about related to freedom in America?
I do think, in our allusion to some of the Supreme Court decisions references this, I do think that our constitutional structure is holding. And I do think that when you look at what's happening in the courts, when you look at when push comes to shove, whether people will take on their responsibilities of office holding, Americans are living up to their role. And so I do think that in the midst of all this chaos that we're describing, all this unrest, all of this threat, this new threat to freedom, I think, from some of the culture-producing institutions in our country and in the West more broadly, we do see a reassertion of the constitutional idea at work in the courts, at work in the legal culture, at work among some office holders, and that gives me hope.
George, last word to you.
Well, I'm not a little ray of sunshine, but it does seem to me it's important to remember that there are 333 million people in this country, and at any given moment, 325 million of them are not watching cable television, and they're not listening to talk radio. They're raising children and fixing the screen door and getting on with life. We're not saturated with politics, and people will rebel against that. It took one sentence by Terry McAuliffe in one debate in the Virginia gubernatorial election last year. Parents shouldn't be telling schools what to teach, and the state rose up, and which indicates to me that the instincts are still pretty sound. We're still not comfortable with the administrative state, with bureaucracies and all that. I'll close. You quoted Milton Friedman. Friedman once said, take any three letters from the alphabet, doesn't matter which ones. Put them in any order you want, doesn't matter. You'll have an acronym designating a federal agency we can do without. And I think that's not quite true, but it's an indication of the restless, individualistic, I dare say, Goldwater-ish strain in American life.
Well, that's a great point, and I'll just add in my closing thought that Ronald Reagan used to make sure to end every single one of his speeches with a paean to the American people, to say, look, if you just let people do what they want to do, great things will happen. And it's easy to be pessimistic if all you do is go on Twitter or X or cable news and say, oh gosh, all these sour people yelling at each other. But as you said rightly, George, most people are not yelling at each other. Most people are working together. Most people are doing great things outside of the camera's eye. And to all those who are watching C-SPAN, thinking about these issues, we're grateful to all of you as well. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.